Good evening, everybody. We'll just give it a few minutes to let everyone join, and then we'll get started. We've got another 10 or so people registered, so we'll wait until about 5 past, and then we'll crack on. And if they're a bit late, they can join as we go. Okay, that's 5 past, so I think we'll get going. There's still a few more people to come, but I think it's about time we get started. It is 5 past. So this is going to be the last webinar in the Story of Bees series. And today I want to talk a little bit about some of the threats that bees face, but also maybe some of the things that we as individuals can try and do to help that. But before we get into that, we'll do a little recap on the 2 sessions from before, because there were 2 webinars that came before this. For those of you that came to those, thank you, and thanks for coming back. But for those of you who didn't, don't worry, you don't need to have watched them to learn something from today. And they are available online as well on our sustainability webpage. So in the first webinar, we looked at essentially what bees are and where they evolved from. So we learnt that they are essentially wasps, vegetarian wasps. And so they're a small branch of the wasp family. So you can think of them as the same group, essentially. And we also looked at where they came from in geological time, and we learned that they evolved, at least as far as we know, in the Cretaceous period. And it sort of coincides with the diversification of the flowering plants. And that's where that bond between flowering plants and bees was first forged. And it's driven their evolution, both flowering plants and bees, ever since that time. Then we looked at how they actually first came to Australia, because it didn't evolve in Australia. So they came in what we believe to be 2 routes. Back in the Cretaceous period, at least towards the middle of the Cretaceous period, Australia, Antarctica, and South America were still joined, or very, very close to each other. And so it enabled the movement of animals across that land bridge. And some of our oldest bees, and actually Australia has some of the oldest lineages of bees, came from this land bridge. But there was a second colonization far closer to our current time. So the movement across Antarctica would have occurred during the Cretaceous, but the later wave that came via Asia, we think maybe only up to 1 million years ago. So we have some very old lineages, and we have some quite new ones as well. So our stingless bees, especially our tetragonula, they belong to that younger branch. And then when we moved on to the second webinar, and we looked at how bees feed and how they navigate around their environment. So we looked at the concept of why bees actually visit flowers. We know that pollination is a key service that bees supply, but they don't go to flowers to pollinate them. That's coincidental. They go to flowers to feed from them, and they feed primarily from nectar and pollen. And from the plant's perspective, they are just hoping that the bee will go to another plant of the same species and drop the pollen off. So we talk about the relationship between flowering plants and bees as a mutualism, and that's true. But they're not helping each other out willingly, if you understand what I mean. It's almost like mutual manipulation. And then we looked at nesting, and another key part of bees' ecology. And we also looked at the comparison of social versus solitary species. The vast majority of bees are solitary. So the bees that we all know and we see in the media are the social ones, but actually they are the exception. The vast majority of bees are solitary, and they live on their own. And then from that, we've thought about, well, how do bees nest? And actually, the vast majority of bees nest in the ground. So we think of bees nesting in big hives and these big conglomerates, or perhaps in trees, but actually the vast majority, especially in Australia, nest in the ground. So that covers just a little brief recap of some of the stuff we touched before. And now we'll get on to the meat of the current webinar. So before I go into this, a little bit of housekeeping. If you have got any questions, please do ask, but make sure that you put them in the Q&A box. So depending on how you're viewing a screen, there'll either be a taskbar at the top or the bottom, and you'll see a little Q&A tab there. Use that, put your question in there, and we'll look at answering them at the end. Okay, so the topic for today is going to be looking at the challenges and the threats that our bees face in the modern world, and hopefully a way that we can try and help them and conserve them as time goes on. So I'm going to start with a bit of myth busting, and and I apologise to anyone who keeps honeybees out there, but they're going to get a little bit of a bashing now, not because they've done anything wrong, but because of our perception of them. So when we think about saving the bees, if we look in the media, and especially media, in fact, you'll actually find that it's often championed by the honeybee. But the concept that the honeybee is endangered or in decline is actually a myth. Honeybee numbers have been growing steadily for decades and still do. So the concept that they are somehow vulnerable, well, perhaps vulnerable is not the right word, but that they are in decline is definitely not true. And in fact, in many situations, especially where the honeybee is not native, which actually is the vast majority of the countries that it exists in now, it actually has quite a lot of negative effects as well, especially on the native bees. So research has shown that honeybees can reduce the numbers of native bees in the same area as them. They can also reduce the species richness of native bees in that area too. They reduce the floral availability because they forage in such huge numbers. And they're also prolific disease carriers, and these diseases can spill over to our native species. And research has also shown that when we look at the networks of pollinators, so what I mean by that is how different pollinators interact with different flowers in an ecosystem and how those bonds form, that actually honeybees can negatively affect those, especially in areas where they don't belong naturally. So bit of myth busting there, where you'll see a lot of save the bees and it will be a honeybee, but actually they're not really the ones that need saving. So this is just a graphic that just shows you the numbers of honeybee hives, essentially, over the last sort of 50 years or so. This runs up to 2015, but actually it tracks pretty true for current times as well. So you can see that globally, the numbers of honeybees are climbing, and they're still climbing now. So the idea of supporting honeybees for conservation is a little bit inaccurate, but it's also worth remembering what they are. Honeybees they're not, when I talk about them not being native, that's one thing, but they're also not wild, not strictly speaking. The honeybee is, for all intents and purposes, a domesticated animal in the same way that a Frisian cow is. We have bred them over many, many generations to do a job for us, to produce honey and to pollinate. So really, these are domesticated animals and shouldn't be put in the same box as wild bees. So it doesn't mean that they're not important, they don't have a place in our society, but it's important to see them for what they are: domesticated animal, as opposed to our native bees, which we would consider wild animals and worthy of conservation in that respect. So on to bee declines more broadly. So firstly, not all species are in decline. It is worth saying that. There are a few species that are doing exceptionally well. So a great example is the tree bumblebee in Europe, which is its numbers are increasing drastically. But actually, overall, if you look at bees as an entire group, the evidence seems to suggest they're starting to struggle. So this graphic here, what it actually shows you is the top graph there shows you the number of records recorded from 1900. So this basically means number of specimens and number of occurrences of sightings of bees that have been recorded. And so you'll see that over time, as you might expect, as we explore more of our planet and as there becomes more and more agency for scientists to go out and study these things, that the number of occurrences and specimens that get logged increases. The bottom graph shows you the species richness of those occurrences. So that's the number of species that are being found. And as you can see, it kind of peaks in somewhere around the 1980s. And actually, as time goes on, you can see, even though we're actually logging more records of sightings and specimens, our species richness is dropping. So that suggests that we are losing bee species as time goes on. So that's a really good indicator that bees, in terms of their species richness, really are in decline. And that's worrying because they are arguably our most important pollinator. And so without them, we would seriously struggle. So why? Why are we getting these declines? Why is this happening? Unfortunately, it's not simple. Well, nothing ever is it? But, excuse me, there's a plethora of reasons why we might be seeing declines in bees. So just to name a few of them, and these are the ones I'll concentrate on today, pesticide exposure. So as we've intensified our agriculture, we use more and more chemicals in the environment, so bees are becoming more and more exposed to those. Habitat destruction. Land clearance is a huge issue, especially here in Australia. And as we clear our native vegetation, often for agriculture, this negatively affects a huge number of animals, not just bees. Disease is a big one. I'm sure a lot of you here will be aware of the varroa mite that recently landed in New South Wales that affects honeybees. It's a risk, yes, to honeybees, but it can possibly pose risks to other bees, which we'll get onto later. But we're finding that there's new diseases coming through, and that might be, and we don't really know why necessarily they're coming through, but that's definitely a risk for our native bees. Climate change, well, I mean, you can put all life on Earth under that category, I think. But climate change is a big driver. It's going to affect not just our lives as human beings, but the lives of all animals on the planet. And then the last one is alien species. So what I mean by alien species, you might also consider them to be invasive species, but I use the term alien to indicate that they do not come from Australia originally. And Australia has a fraught history with invasive species, almost invariably our fault in the first place. Or I say our fault, European settlers' fault. And these can have severe effects on the ecosystem. And actually, in terms of bees, it's something we're only just scratching the surface of. Tied in here, and I haven't put it as a single point, but I'm going to mention it anyway, is this concept of nutritional degradation. So what we are seeing is in the environment that we're seeing a severe reduction in the both sheer volume of nutrition available to bees, but also the quality of that nutrition as well. We're also degrading the quality that's available. That's having a huge impact on bees' health. And as you can imagine, if you're unhealthy, you're more vulnerable to many other things that could do you damage too. So there's no smoking gun here. There's no single culprit. I think you can probably put humanity pretty strongly in the center, but in terms of individual reasons, there is no one. They're all going to sort of play a role, and we'll talk about how they come together and affect each other later on. So we'll start with pesticides. Probably not news to anybody here that pesticides are not great for insects or for bees. However, they are a prevalent part of our society, both in terms of agriculture and our urban lifestyle as well. They invariably cause negative effects. There's not really any positives that can be gained in terms of direct positive effects on bees for pesticides. But I think a lot of people think of pesticides as something that a bee comes in contact with and it dies instantly. But actually, it's a spectrum. So you can get insecticides that do that, but there are many insecticides actually that cause sublethal effects. So they don't kill the bee outright, but they weaken them in other ways. Now, unfortunately, Australia is a stronghold for incredibly toxic pesticides. So I've put the example here of neonicotinoids. Now, neonicotinoids is a wide plethora of chemicals. The one you can see here is imidacloprid, but there's a wide array of them, and they all work in a similar way. And they've been under the spotlight now for, I would say, at least 20 years. And at least 3 of them are completely banned in Europe, and certain states of the US and Canada as well, all because of the very strong body of evidence that they significantly harm bee populations. Unfortunately, Australia is not on that banned list, so you can still use these chemicals here in Australia. They're still used widely in agriculture, and actually you can go into your local Bunnings and buy one off the shelf. It's frighteningly easy how easy it is to get your hands on these chemicals. Now, neonicotinoids tend to affect the bee's brain and the way it functions in the environment. So they don't necessarily kill a bee straight off, but they do affect them in other ways, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. Neonics are not by any means the only chemical that can do them damage. Many of you will have heard of fipronil that's being used to eradicate the infected honeybee hives in New South Wales currently. This would be just as toxic to another bee should it come in contact with them. And unfortunately, the agricultural pesticides are not regulated particularly well, but in comparison to the regulation in urban settings, they're head and shoulders above. There really is very little scrutiny or data about the volumes of pesticides used in the urban environment by individuals like us in our houses or in our gardens. And it's worth stating as well that some of our herbicides, such as glyphosate, is also quite nasty stuff that can really harm insects as well. So in terms, we've covered a little bit about how they affect the bees, but I want to focus on the sublethal stuff here. So it can essentially affect the bee in a way that it doesn't kill them outright, but it might inhibit their ability to forage properly. They may forget where they live. There's research has shown that it stops them sleeping as well, and that they can show reduced care to their offspring. So all of these things, as you can imagine, can lead to really negative effects on the bees population as a whole. Now, I put a little graphic in here of the neonicotinoids, because a lot of neonicotinoids they're not sprayed in the way that you sometimes see in the videos with these big trucks that are spraying them over the crops. A lot of them are applied as a seed treatment, and then they grow into the plant, and then the neonics move through the plant and provide protection against numerous pests. Now, that was thought to be a safer, environmentally at least, safer way to deliver pesticides, and arguably that could be true. There's no, you use less chemical, and you are not doing these huge mass sprays that will touch everything. But actually, it's also a slightly more insidious way of the pesticide getting into the environment. It leaches into the soil, it leaches into the nectar and the pollen of the plants, and it gets passed on to the bees that way. I've put there as well the idea of the solitary bees being slightly more at risk, and studies have shown that bees vary in their sensitivity to pesticides. So really, we don't know a huge amount about bees at all. We know a lot about the honeybee, but the rest of them not so much. So, and if you can imagine, many of our native bees are smaller than a honeybee. So if they were to consume the same amount of chemical, it would have a much bigger impact on their little bodies than it would a slightly larger bee. So another reason is that the solitary bees, a lot of them nest in the ground, and a lot of these chemicals can leach into the soil. So they're coming in direct contact with contaminated soil, which they're unable to detect. And so therefore, they can't tell the difference between areas that are contaminated and those that aren't. So I've got a little video here, which I'm really hoping will play, of an experiment that's been done on bumblebees. And it shows just one effect, one sublethal effect of what a neonicotinoid can do when a bee is exposed to it. Let's see if it'll play.
The humble bumblebee.
I'll talk you through as we go.
Adorable, and a vital player in our ecosystem.
So this was done in the United States.
Pollinating crops across the country. But what happens when these critical pollinators come in contact with widely used pesticides? Researchers set out to answer this question by testing the behavioral effects of a popular insecticide, imidacloprid, on colonies of bumblebees. They chose bumblebees due to the size of their colonies, which are much smaller than honeybee colonies, making it easier to observe individual bees. To track their behavior, each bee was outfitted with its own small waterproof 2D barcode that would allow a robotic camera to record the movement of each bee individually. The colonies were separated into different tracking arenas, each consisting of a nesting area and a foraging area. The bees were given access to nectar with varying concentrations of imidacloprid, similar to what they might ingest out in the wild. The scientists used a camera mounted on a custom robotic chassis to periodically check in on each colony. Their findings were striking. Within 24 hours, colonies that were exposed to the pesticide.
But I want to pause it here just so that you can get a good look at what's happening. So you can see on the pre-exposure colony, the bumblebees are all interacting with each other. They're all they're on the brood. They're doing jobs. They're interacting with each other. But if you look on the post-exposure one, the ones that have been exposed to the pesticide, you can see they're all sort of just sitting about, not doing anything. Now, we don't get bumblebees in Australia, at least not naturally. A couple in Tasmania, which we'll touch on, but we do have social species here. So if we imagine, if we can, that this is perhaps a colony of our stingless bees, for example, it's not difficult to imagine why the behavior you see in the post-exposure could have serious effects on the health of a colony, because they're not doing the jobs they need to be doing. They're not looking after the young, they're not cleaning, they're not interacting with each other. So it's very difficult for them to pass on information. So that just shows that although they've ingested this pesticide, which they would do at a flower, and it's not killed them outright, it has seriously affected the health of their colony. And that could easily be enough to wipe that colony out, especially if there was another stressor involved. So there's a little bit more of the video, but that's the thing I really wanted to focus on, is to really think, just to show you what I mean by a sublethal effect and how it might influence it. Now, if we take that a step further and apply that to a solitary bee who does all the work, she builds the nest, she lays the eggs, she gathers the food, she does all the cleaning, you can imagine that if similar behavior were to happen in a solitary bee, her entire nest would probably die because she wouldn't be looking after it. And this is just one sublethal effect. So as I mentioned, there's been evidence to show that bees get lost, they can't find their way home, they're unable to locate appropriate food sources, and other similar effects like that. So you can see how in the past we've looked at, oh, does a pesticide kill something outright? And when it doesn't, everyone's fine with it. But actually, it's far more complex than that. And we need to think about how it affects their behavior and their ecology, generally speaking. Right, let's see if we can get that to move on. There we go. Okay, right, so that covers pesticides. Covers is perhaps the wrong word. We've touched on it. We could do an entire talk on pesticides, but I just wanted to highlight that for you. And it's going to be the same for all the topics. We're going to touch on them, and it'll give you a really good idea of what they're doing. And then there's room there to dig deeper. So, habitat destruction. Now, Australia is, I consider it a national shame. We have the highest rate of land clearance of any Western country. And we're right up there with deforestation hotspots. In fact, we're listed as a deforestation hotspot, which I think, considering we know a lot better, is shameful. And we've done terrible damage to our native bushland in the very small amount of time since European occupation. Now, this map here shows you the amount of forest clearance and bushland clearance generally since European settlement, which I think in this data set was about 1750 to 2008. I'm sorry to say it's only got worse since then. So we haven't stopped land clearing. We've kept doing it at quite a high rate. And you can see the eastern states are particularly badly affected. New South Wales there doesn't look so bad. Actually, that's a slight fault in the way the data is collected. A lot of the degraded bushlands there are actually cleared. So it's worse than it looks even on there. And you can see here, since 2017 alone, we've seen a threefold increase in land clearance in New South Wales. We clear, this was in 2019, so it may be worse now, 2,000 hectares every day in Australia, gone, cleared. Which it's incredibly difficult to see that in your mind, to see how much destruction that is, but it's vast. And so, as you can imagine, for the native wildlife of Australia, it's devastating. And we're talking about bees today in terms of the huge loss of flowering resources, nesting resources that they lose from land clearance. But there's very few native animals in Australia that are immune to this. They all suffer because of it, and so do we actually as well. So With land clearance, the biggest loss in terms of the bees are flowering resources. They lose their food, they lose access to the native flowers that they need. And it's a huge driver of decline. Many of our bees don't have huge foraging ranges. They might spend their entire life within 500 meters of where they nest or less. So, pardon me, you can imagine that if a whole huge swathe of bush is removed, how that could essentially wipe out bees in that area completely. A lot of our bees are what we call univoltine, so they reproduce once a year, and the adults die off, and the young hatch out again in the spring. Unlike our stingless bees, for example, which are perennial. Now, the risk in that is that if you wipe out an entire adult population through clearance one year, they will never come back, or it will take them a very long time to come back because there is no perpetuating reproduction there. You've lost that reproductive group. So they are very, very vulnerable to land clearance. And simply put, if there's no flowers, there's no bees. In fact, you could probably reverse that round in many respects as well. But bees don't just need flowers. They also need somewhere to nest. And losing your nesting habitat can actually be a real key driver to extinctions. So a really classic example of that is the green carpenter bee. So that's Zolicopa aurata, beautiful endemic native Australian species. We're very lucky in Ku-ring-gai that we actually get them in Ku-ring-gai. But they used to range from Queensland all the way down through New South Wales, through Victoria, into South Australia. However, now they're extinct everywhere, but a few small pockets in New South Wales and Kangaroo Island. And the primary reason for that is habitat loss. So they nest primarily in mature Banksia, and Banksia are of the age that it started to develop white rot. That's normally about 20 years, maybe a little bit longer. So you can imagine that if you clear an area, and even if you were to replant it immediately afterwards, it's going to take decades for it to recover to a point where these bees can really, really come back. And because, like many others, they're univoltine, it becomes very difficult for them to do that. In many cases, they don't. Now, they also do use grass trees, Xanthorrhea stems, which are far more robust, but with our increasing fire intensity, we're finding that even some of these really hardy plants that normally bounce back after a fire are really starting to struggle. So little things like that, in terms of you clear an area and you try and regenerate it, even then you're not necessarily bringing back what was there. What was there is lost. So moving on to disease. Now, disease in native bees, actually, we know very, very little about it. I mean, that's a general rule for our native bees across the board, but disease in particular, we really don't know a huge amount. What we do know is that diseases are very highly prevalent in domesticated species. And apologies for the typo there, I just saw that. Now, that's not unusual. We know a lot about disease in honeybees. We know quite a lot about disease in bumblebees as well, but many bumblebee species have been commercialized over the years. Now, honeybees have a plethora of diseases that come with them, and they are under threat significantly in terms of their economic viability because of this. The risk in terms of our wild bees is that honeybees are not controlled in the same way as other feral animals. So in most areas of the country, honeybee hives are just left to do whatever they want if they go feral, which means that they can form real sinks of disease. Not only is that bad for professional beekeepers, because it can, even if they're keeping their hives very clean, if their bees are interacting with diseased feral colonies, then there can be disease crossover there. But they can also be pathogen spillover to native species. Now, I've put a picture of a bumblebee here, which obviously we don't get here in Australia, but this has got a deformed wing virus. And deformed wing virus is thought to have been passed on from honeybees. And the honeybee that you can see there has got a varroa mite attached to it. The varroa mite that recently landed in Newcastle would be very, very detrimental to the Australian honeybee industry, which alone is a good enough reason to attempt to remove it. However, we know that the varroa mite itself does not infect other bee species because it's very tightly tied to the honeybee life cycle. However, the varroa mite also passes on diseases to the honeybees, deformed wing virus being one of them. And something like a virus has a much stronger chance of jumping a species barrier to another bee. They're far more adaptable. So we know that that's a risk. The challenge is we don't know a huge amount about disease in native bees, as I mentioned. One example in our stingless bees, this is Tetragonium carbonaria, is Shank's disease. We've known about Shank's disease for a while now, but we don't have a huge information still about how it works and where it comes from. But it's a bacterial infection that infects the brood of our stingless bees. It's not always fatal, but it certainly can be, and it certainly makes the bees more vulnerable. So you can see on the left there a healthy brood comb of Tetragonula, beautiful spiral, lovely symmetrical waxy cells, and then on the right there, this is actually a hive I found this year in our LGA, is one that's infected by Shank's. So you can see the brood's broken, it's lost that spiral effect. There's a huge amount of blackening in there. And what happens is the larvae that are exposed to the bacterium, they die and they start to degrade, they start to rot, basically. So what you're seeing there is necrosis, and it goes black, and the worker bees have to get rid of them. But of course, if you lose all your offspring, there's no one there to replace the old generation. So it can seriously limit a hive's ability to survive. So the next threat on the list, climate change. As I mentioned at the beginning, climate change is something that's going to affect all of us, humanity, all the animal kingdom. And bees are no exception to this. It is going to be a serious challenge for our native bees across the board to try and adapt and cope with the level of climate change that's already occurred, not to even mention what may occur in the next 15 to 20 years. And so one of the quite visually obvious ones is the unseasonable and extreme weather events we get. So we know from the Black Summer bushfires, huge intensity of bushfire now, but we've only got to look in our backyard in New South Wales to see the extent of the flooding that's occurred as well. And obviously these natural disasters destroy a huge swathe of environment when they do it. Australia is a country of extreme weather, it always has been, but what we're seeing is those extremes are increasing in intensity and they're increasing in their occurrence as well. And that's going to be a challenge for all of us. But I've also put phenological mismatches on there. So this is something that's a little bit more subtle. So what I mean by that is bees and plants are reliant on each other, and flowers often only bloom for a certain time, and bees are often only around for certain times of the year. Now, as the climate begins to change and the cues that encourage bees to come out of diapause, which is often what a lot of the solitary bees spend the winter in, or for the flowers to bloom, start to change, they start to miss each other. And you start to have flowers that are blooming when the bees aren't ready, or you start to have no blooms when the bees are ready. So you can imagine how dangerous that can be for an ecosystem if the two parties that need to cooperate aren't meeting each other in time and space. And that's a much more subtle effect of climate change that's much harder to see just with the naked eye. But in many respects, it could be more dangerous than some of the real extreme sort of huge visual events that we see like the bushfires. And that's just an example of the flooding. And you can imagine if you're a ground nesting bee and you were there, well, that's that gone. So any ground nesting bees in that area will most likely have had their nests swamped. And perhaps the adults survived, but certainly the nests wouldn't have done. So alien species. Now I'm going to focus on alien bee species for this one. but we could also have the same conversation about alien plants as well. But I'm going to focus on bees just to try and keep it a little bit narrower. So alien species in this context are species that are not native to Australia. They don't belong in this country, and they've either been brought here by us deliberately, or perhaps they've made their way accidentally through shipping or trade or various other routes of ingress. So the sort of classic one actually that gets a lot of attention in Australia in terms of bees is the bumblebee. So believed to be accidentally introduced from New Zealand maybe about 20 years ago now. It's now become prolific across Tasmania, and is showing itself to be very, very efficient, just like it is in its native territory. But of course, because it doesn't belong there, it's really disrupting the ecology of Tasmania. It's spreading weeds, it's outcompeting native species, and it's damaging the floral networks that they interact with. And it undermines biosecurity as well. They can be a disease vector as well. But actually, if you look at some of the stories about the bumblebees, there's on that picture there, interestingly, it says impact native bees and honeybees, which I think is a bit rich because the honeybees have had quite an impact themselves. But it just shows how, when we think about something like the bumblebee compared to the honeybee, how they're not considered the same in terms of what they do, but actually they're very, very similar. They're both alien species. They are both, they can both be damaging to the environment. So when we think about bees in Australia, and you see it all the time, it is still dominated by many of these alien species, but actually our native species are the ones we really should be focusing on. Now, the other bee that I put there is a lesser known invasive. It's the African carder bee. This is a solitary species, and I would imagine that when most people see this bee, they probably think it is a native because they're just not they're not familiar with it. But it is an invasive. It's not thought to be as damaging as the two social species that you see here. But it has established itself in small areas, and it certainly, at best, would have a neutral impact on the ecosystem that it's in. So alien species are often more competitive because if they weren't, they wouldn't have made it. So you will certainly get alien species that can try and establish, and they're just not as good, and then they die. But if an alien has, then often it's because it can outcompete the natives. It can often spread diseases that our native bees would never have normally come in contact with, and so don't have any defenses against. And especially in the case of the honeybee, seriously deplete floral resources. Both the bumblebee and the honeybee are well suited to colder climates. So they're able to come out earlier in the morning and forage off of the plants before the native bees are able to fly. So they can strip an area quite efficiently of resources. And a sort of one of the other ones is we just don't know a lot. And that's one of the big problems. It's really hard to try and save something or change something when you don't know what you're working with. You know, we have probably around 2,000 native species of bee in Australia, and we know a little bit about a tiny fraction of them. And the vast majority, we know nothing at all. And so trying to protect these bees or trying to change the way things work without knowing their behavior, their ecology, is really, really challenging. Historically, and this is true across the globe, we've used knowledge in honeybees and applied it to different species of bee. Because we have such a huge bank of research and knowledge of the honeybee, we think, oh, well, they're all bees, we'll apply it to everybody else. But actually, we're increasingly finding that that is a really bad idea, and that actually they simply don't behave in the same way. In many respects, they can be polar opposites. So relying on knowing something in the honeybee and applying it to our natives really isn't very reliable. So we really need to step up and start to do more on our native species and learn more about them if we are to protect them sufficiently. So it really does hinder our ability to protect them. So the map there just shows you a map of species richest of bees across Australia. So you can see there's a peak in the eastern states of New South Wales and Victoria there, but also another peak in WA. So we do have some really rich areas of bee diversity in Australia. And the little picture on the left actually shows a new species of bee that was found in 2021. And in fact, it was one of 5 new species previously unknown to science that was found in Australia. Now, on one hand, that's really exciting. It's very cool to be able to find brand new species that science has never described before in 2021. But it also highlights, well, if we've only just discovered it, we basically know nothing about it other than it now exists. So it just shows you that the depth of our ignorance, really, with many of our native species. Right, so the real challenge is that none of these threats you can't compartmentalize any of these threats. They don't work on their own. They can't be isolated. They each impacts the other. So there's this synergy. So it's the idea that together they create a result that's greater than the sum of their parts. Hence the little small mathematical equation there. So the idea, so we might take climate change, for example, and we might take pesticides. When we combine those two things together, we actually create a compounded effect that can have a greater impact on bees than either of them on their own, or even just the additive of the two. So this makes for a really toxic combination, and it also makes it very, very challenging to both solve the problem, but also show what's happening. Because often when you try and do research to show what is happening to the bees, people want to have a smoking gun, and unfortunately, we can't give them one. So this is just a little example of this. So climate change leads to extreme weather, which can lead to habitat destruction through bushfire and floods, which then increases the effects of climate change because we have less carbon storage, and we get this vicious cycle. With habitat destruction comes lack of food. We move that on to a slightly more complex but equally interacting system. Lack of food would lead to reduced nutrition for bees, which would impair their ability to forage properly. The lack of food also impairs their ability to forage because they have to go further to find it. It reduces pollination efficiency because the bees can't find the flowers, which then comes back to lack of food again. If we look at reduced nutrition, it makes them unhealthy, which makes them more vulnerable to pesticides and disease. If you're exposed to pesticides and disease, it impairs your foraging capability, and so on and so forth. And these things cycle around in vicious circles, and they can really, really build up and compound over time. So what can we do about it? I put this picture on here because I think for a long time we've buried our head in the sand about a lot of these problems, and that's really not what we should be doing. I'm not entirely sure why the gentleman at the front there has also taken his trousers down. He obviously feels very strongly about that. But anyway, this was actually in Sydney. This was a protest, I think, in 2014 about our climate change policies. But if we accept that there's lots of dangers, we accept there's a challenge, but also step up and accept the responsibility of doing something about it, we can. So fundamentally, what do bees need? That's what we need to ask ourselves. What do they need so that we can give it to them? They need somewhere to live, and they need something to eat. That's the sort of real two big ones, okay? Now, on top of that, we need to learn more about them. We need to reduce our land clearing. We need to tackle climate change. But these are all very big things, and it's very intimidating for an individual to try and think about trying to tackle that. So there are things we can do ourselves to put our little bit in to try and help. So one, we really want to try and conserve and create diverse nutritional resources, give them the food they need, but not just in volume, in quality. We want them to have the best quality food. In the same way that eating 20 hamburgers is not the same as eating a salad, it's the same principle. This idea you've got to have balance. You've got to have a balance in their nutrition, okay? And the key to balance in terms of bees is diversity, floral diversity, lots of different flowers that all offer slightly different things. They'll offer nectar, they'll offer pollen, some of them offer both. But there'll be different qualities in there and different chemicals that exist in each, which will help them balance it. And diversity is twofold. So we want species richness, we want lots of different types of flowering resources, but we also want to make sure that when we're planting for bees, we provide food throughout the year. We don't want to have a huge glut in spring and then nothing else the rest of the year, because that won't help them. They exist there all the time, more or less. So they're going to want to have resources all year round. But it's not all about planting. We do still, I mean, I know I've said we've cleared a load of land and we've done a terrible job, and we have, but we also do have some great resources left still. And we should really look after those, because the natural resources that we have are what they really, really need. So looking after that is really great, and maintaining the diversity within those systems. So not degrading these patches. So we have a lot of patches of bush, for example, that we may consider bushland and look at it and see it as that, but actually it's been degraded quite heavily and it's lost a lot of its diversity, which gives it its strength and its benefits as well. I've also put in there, it doesn't have to be manicured. If you think about your garden, I think sometimes we have this artifact where we think everything has to be clean cut and trimmed, and and actually a bit of mess is quite good. And if you do it right, it can be free form and natural and still look very, very well kept and beautiful, and something you can be proud of. So planting. Now there's a huge list of plants that will be good for bees, and I'm not going to go through all of them here, but I'm just going to list a few. And if you are interested, we do have a list of excellent bee-friendly plants on our website that you can look for. So let's ream off a few natives. So you've got things like lily pillies and tea trees. They're great. They have big gluts of flowers. They're very popular with a wide swathe of bees as well. Hakea macadamias, both really good as well. Hardenbergia, any of the sort of the bush peas, that family, are excellent food resources for pollinators. Their pollinator is normally a very high protein content, which is really useful for the bees. Now, exotics. I would always say if you can plant natives, because they're the ones that the bees have evolved with. They're the ones that have been there naturally for them across their evolutionary history. However, that's not to say that there aren't some exotics that can do a good job. So we've got a few of them there. Herbs can be great, things like basil, coriander, that type of thing. Herbs are also good because when they dry, leave them, don't cut them back. Those dry twigs are really great roosting sites for the males that will often stay out overnight. There's a huge plethora of fruits and veggies that you can list as well. Plenty. Citruses are great. Passion fruits work really well, but there's loads and loads that you can have on that list too. Now, the pictures I've actually put here, they're actually on a weed, actually on cassia, but this just shows this was on one day on one plant, and we've got the green carpenter bee, got a little master bee in the bottom right corner there, and one of our Tetragonula carbonaria on the left. So even a plant that's considered not very helpful and a problem in the bush still provides food to bees. So the point I want to make with that is that if you are looking at clearing weeds away, and they're flowering and they're prolifically flowering, remember, yes, it's good that we get rid of them, but we've got to make sure we put stuff back, because those bees are relying on those resources. They don't know that it's a weed. They don't know that it does damage. They just need to feed from it. So if we do get rid of them, we need to replace them. Presentation. Now, you wouldn't perhaps think of presentation as a real serious consideration, at least maybe not only from our perspective, visually, but actually bees do prefer plants to be clumped in large groups. A, it helps them find them, but B, they like to forage off single plants at the same time. It makes it more efficient for them. So you're saving them energy, they're making more out of what they gather. Right. So when you are planting and think about planting for bees, plant them in blocks, plant them in these sort of big blocks of species that are going to come into flower. And then what you'll find is your garden will have these little, almost like little Christmas lights that pop up with colour whenever they flower. And if you plant with the temporal flowering in mind, you'll always have something coming out, which is really lovely. So nesting. So nests are something else that bees need. We've mentioned that most of them nest in the ground, and we'll touch on that in a minute. But One of the ones that is really easy to provide for are cavity nesters. So things like our leafcutter bees, our resin bees, our masked bees, our reed bees, they all nest in either existing cavities or soft material that they can burrow into. And they're remarkably ingenious, actually. You will find them in their natural hole, but you'll find, I've got one in the brickwork outside my house, a leaf cutter that's decided that a hole in the brick's useful. You find them in hose pipes, you find them in door frames, but obviously it would be much better if we could have them in natural nesting materials. So by providing some of those, you can really help. So this just shows, this is an example of a leafcutter bee there in a metal gatepost. But keep some areas in the garden that are a bit messier, maybe some loose wood, maybe some dried stems, because these are the things that they're going to nest in. So hollow stems and wood are great, especially wood that's been bored and has got old borer holes in it. You can also provide your own material through a bee hotel. So I don't necessarily advocate bee hotels for bee conservation broadly. They're more of an educational tool for you to observe them and to understand them more. However, in a garden setting, they can be really useful, and they're a great engagement tool for kids if you have them, or for yourself. It's great fun. So you can use things like bamboo or lantana, both weeds, which is great because you can clear the weed away and provide habitat for your native bees at the same time. Or you can use simply wooden blocks that are drilled into. And you can provide those in small amounts scattered across the garden rather than a big giant one. So this big giant one here in the bottom corner is the way not to do it. Bee hotels should not be massive. It creates a too dense population of bees that wouldn't naturally come together, and you're going to increase things like disease spread. So these are just some rules about a good hotel. Make sure you've got cavities of the right diameter, 5 to 8 millimeters. Make sure they're deep enough. If they're not deep enough, it can skew the sex ratio of the offspring, and you can really mess with the population dynamics. Make sure you use breathable materials, essentially natural materials. It's got to be secure. You don't want it blowing away or wobbling. And give it some protection against the elements, mainly the rain, but also the sun. You don't want to cook them in the afternoon, so make sure they're going to be in morning sunshine, but nothing else. And as I said, don't make them too big. Now, there are some other bits you can do as well. So you can use soft, sort of rotting branches for carpenter bees. So the green carpenter bee uses those. Please don't go and take Banksia from the bush. But if you have a Banksia at your house and it loses a branch, then keep it. You can always put it out. But also things like mango and jacaranda can sometimes also work too. Now, mud bricks are great because, oh, sorry, it skipped on. So mud bricks are good because you can use those for the blue-banded bees, and we'll touch on how to do that in a second. So ground nesters, most common type of nesting in Australia. So you can see from the pie chart there, about 70% of all Australian bees, that's of the 2,000 that we think are there, nest in the ground. So it's an overwhelming majority. So even if you are providing a bee hotel, you're still only providing for a small number of our bees. So if we want to provide for more, we've got to try and look for some ground sites. Difficult to do because you can't really offer artificial stuff for most of them. So we've got to concentrate on trying to tweak what we have. One way you can do it is think about using raised beds. So raised beds are useful for ground nesting bees because they tend to like reasonably deep soil, and often we have quite shallow soil. And it also gives you a controlled patch of earth that you can keep clear. Use sandy, loamy soil, stuff that the bees can easily dig in and that drains well. And then you can scatter some sort of pebbles or even some seed pods or something that's sort of large over the surface. They often like to nest right next to one of those pebbles or rocks as like a little shelter. And make sure you don't use weed matting or mulch on any of the areas that you want the bees to nest in, because the weed matting will stop them digging down and the mulch will stop them from getting to the soil in the first place. So in terms of natural sites, they tend to be in quite sunny areas that are well drained. So if you've got some already, great, look after it. If you haven't, you can look at trying to tweak areas that you've got to fit that. Now, we mentioned mud bricks. Mud bricks are pretty much the only ones you can make for ground nesters, and they don't supply habitat for a lot of species, but they do work for the blue-banded and the teddy bears, which are quite common, and we do get them quite prolifically in our gardens. Now, all you really need to do is you can use old UPVC drain pipe or stuff like that, but I quite like Besser blocks. It's a bit more rugged, and they weather a bit better. So you can get a hold of some of those. I've said 3 to 4 there. I would probably end up going for 5 or 7, just because then you can stack them in a sort of pyramid and then still have a roof on top to give us some protection. And what you need to do is you need to fill it with a sort of clayey, sandy mix of soil. Now, if you've got that naturally in your garden, great, you can use some of that. If you don't, then something like fine tennis court loam works really well, and you can buy that online fairly easily. Or you can use a mix of sand cement, so you can get a pre-mix of sand cement, and then just add some bricky sand to it, of a ratio of about 1 to 1.5, so 1 sand cement, 1.5 bricky sand. You don't want too much cement because it will dry too hard and they won't be able to dig in it. You can use that, you pack it into the Besser blocks while it's still moist, and then you leave it to dry in the sun. Make sure you put some little starter holes in, which just helps the bees get some traction on it. And you can use the end of a pen to do that pretty easily. Put them out. Don't expect miracles the first season. Normally with blue-banded and teddy bears, it takes at least a season, if not 2, for them to really establish or even find it. So be patient, and although it takes a while, you can get some really great results with it. So, as a summary, so this will be the last slide now. I've been talking for a while, so I don't want to do any more, just for your sakes. But to summarize, what can we do? We can provide food, right? Use natives where you can. Look at making sure that you've got things that are going to bloom for different periods throughout the year, and try and choose plants that bloom for long periods too. Concentrate those plantings so that you don't have a spattering of flowering. You have a nice big obvious clump for the bees to find. You can provide nesting habitat, so you can make sure that you keep some hollow cavities in the garden. That might be just not trimming dead plants right way down to the bottom. It might be introducing some bamboo tubes or a bee hotel. Try and maintain some patches of bare earth, especially sandy or loamy earth. That's going to be really useful for the bees to nest in. And if you do use nesting materials that you put out, keep them clean. So, especially in the case of a bee hotel, the material should be changed every year, every 2 years tops, but really every year. And of course, avoid chemicals in your garden. And I know it's hard sometimes, especially when we get pests on. If any of you there grow veggies and fruits and veggies, pests can be annoying. But just remember that when you spray them, you're also killing the things that are helping you as well. And so sometimes you can throw the baby out with the bathwater. If you do have to treat, be very careful, avoid drift, do it on calm days, do spot stuff. Don't ever spray the whole thing. Right, that's all I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to have a look at the questions now, and hopefully I'll be able to answer them. I'll go down the list, we'll see what we've got. So Graham has said that he's got some stingless bees and that they were attacked by assassin beetles, which he squished, but he feels bad now because they're important. Everything's important in moderation. So the squishing of a few assassin bugs on your stingless beehive is probably not going to do too much damage. All you're really going to do is put them off and they're going to go somewhere else. So I wouldn't feel too bad about that. The same goes with a lot of your pests. You know, if most, generally speaking, especially if they're native, any native insects that we consider pests, in their natural population sizes, they're necessary. They have a job. It's when you start to get these spikes that it can become a problem. So we're not looking to eradicate. I think that's a really important thing to state. When you've got pests, try and have a mindset of rather than saying I want none, is to say, well, what's the manageable level of pests that I can accept? Because that's actually a healthier way to manage it. So Graham, don't feel too bad about it. You've only swatted a few. It's not like you went over it with a chemical, I really, so I hope you didn't, and sprayed everything. A bit of manual squashing, fine. So I think that answers that one. So Faye has asked, is the Kangaroo Island monitoring carpenter bee populations after devastating fires? So I mentioned about the green carpenter bee earlier, and that one of its final strongholds is in Kangaroo Island. Yes, they are monitoring it. So a university research group at the University of Adelaide, run by Katja Hogendoorn, does all of the conservation work on Kangaroo Island in relation to the green carpenter bee. It was hit incredibly hard during the fires recently on Kangaroo Island. Many of the experimental nests were wiped out. We don't yet know how well that population will bounce back. There is a possibility down the line that they may need to be translocations from New South Wales to bolster those populations. We always hope that's not the case, because translocation should always be the last option, because the Kangaroo Island population and the New South Wales population have been isolated for a very long time, so we'd be mixing two genetic lineages that would not mix naturally. But that may be a possibility. But yes, as a short answer, yes, they are monitoring it. It's still ongoing, and as far as I'm aware, it's still going now. So Wendy asks, do echidnas eat native stingless bees? I've never seen an echidna at a stingless beehive, but it's not to say that they wouldn't. But generally speaking, any of these sort of larger animals, whether it be bearded dragons or blue tongues or anything like that, that might eat a few of the native stingless bees, fine, let them. It's not, they're not going to eat the entire colony. They'll eat a few out of the front. And if you've got a particularly persistent water dragon, for example, then the bees will essentially just close the door eventually. It just won't come out until the dragon leaves. So yes, they may do. Should you worry about it? No. Okay, so Katie's asking a question about lantana. So she says, I have lantana that's grown in the backyard, and I was planning on cutting it down near the base of it, paint it with Roundup, and then cover the wound with a plastic bag to prevent contact with any animals. How problematic would that be? Lantana's a hard one. So in terms of what we do when we manage lantana in bush care, so when we're caring for the bush, we rarely eradicate it completely from an area. The primary reason for that is that actually it forms a significant proportion of small bird habitat. Now, when it is removed, however, there are often only certain ways that you can do that. So you mentioned there about the sort of the painting of the stumps with Roundup or a chemical. That type of targeted herbicide is the best way to apply a herbicide. Do it in a way that's only going to affect that individual plant. It's not perfect, but with something like lantana that's incredibly prolific and voracious, there aren't many options. What I would say is, if you are going to do that with your lantana, think about trying to replace it with some shrubs as soon as you can, so that you are going to provide some of that habitat, especially for the small birds, back. But there are going to be cases where something like a herbicide is necessary. But applying it in the correct fashion is the most important thing. So I hope that gives you a little bit of guidance on that. Yes, so Mark Ross Smith asks, do you have a list of suitable flowers, herbs, etc. on the sustainability website? Yeah, we do. Yeah, so there's a list on our Stingless Bee webpage that has got a really good list of native plants that are available in New South Wales, so you should be able to get them fairly easily. You can also go to the Ku-ring-gai Wildflower Garden Nursery that has a number of plants there specifically labelled as bee friendly, and you can use those as well. So there are lists out there. I'm trying to think of the name now. Megan Howcroft of Bee Business has some excellent plant lists. She's a bee scientist, very prolific bee scientist. So look for her in Google, simple Google Megan Howcroft Bee Business, and you'll be able to find some great plant lists there as well. Wendy again asked, should we be concerned about brush turkeys in the same area as our hive? No, let me get on with it. They're not going to, well, I mean, you can be concerned about brush turkeys or something else, but they're not going to do any damage to a hive. They might knock it over, but then a dog might do that, just put it back. Brush turkeys are here to stay. They're going to be something we have to put up with, but they're not any danger to our bees. Our apologies. Elsa says, please do the question more slowly. I apologise. I do speak very fast. It's just naturally what I do. If there's one of the questions you'd like me to go through again, please put it in the Q&A and I'll do it now. Bearing in mind, all of this is recorded. So if you're trying to write notes, don't worry, there will be stuff on there. Katie asks, is there a list of non-native plants as well? I don't have a list of non-native plants on the website, but there are lists out there. They tend to be focused towards honeybees, but many of them will also be suitable. Just be wary of exotics in terms of whether they're likely to self-seed or escape the garden and into native areas. Not all of them do. There's plenty that are quite self-contained, but just be wary of that if you do choose that. Graham says, can I share my screen of this hummingbird? I'm afraid you can't, Graham, not on this one, but you're welcome to send it through to me and I can send it out to everybody else. Right, unless I think that's all the questions I've done. I apologise if I have gone through some of the questions a bit quickly. It's just I do speak fast, so I apologise for that. If there is anything that anyone wants me to clarify, please do put it in the Q&A and I'll do it, and I'll consciously talk slower so that I don't go through things too quickly. But other than that, that's the end of the series and the end of the webinar as well. I hope those of you that saw all of 3 of them enjoyed them and that you learned something from them. I don't know the next time we'll be doing something, but it'll be advertised through the Sustainability E-News as well as through our Facebook page when I do. So, and remember, all of my previous talks are available on our website that you can watch at your leisure. So I'll just give a couple more minutes for anyone who wants to ask any more questions, but I'm going to call that the end. So if you want to start to go, you can go, and I'll just hang around for a few more minutes. Okay, so there's been a couple more that have come up. Rosemary has asked, is there a good reason for land clearing? Christ, that's a really good question. I suppose it depends on what side of the fence you stand on. So land clearing is normally for agriculture, generally speaking. So of course, the one argument is that, well, we need to provide food for us. We need to farm. We need, in order to support our populations. But I think it's worth also thinking about where we clear land, if we do need to do it, and doing it from a perspective of looking at it as, do we need to clear this land, rather than can we clear this land? Because what it tends to be at the moment is land clearing is people look at legislation and go, oh yeah, I can chop that down and then just clear it. But that's the wrong mentality. We should be valuing our natural bushland and forests for the amazing job that they do and saying, is there any way we don't have to do this? Is there a way we can repurpose a site that's already degraded? Is there a way that we can repurpose a brownfield site, for example, that has suddenly become free? Do we have to clear this? So I suppose there is a reason for land clearing. You know, we will need new houses, we will need farmland. but I would argue that we have got our priorities wrong with how we decide whether that's necessary. And it's become more about how much money can we make by clearing this land, and not about does it actually benefit society. So that's what I would say on that one. There's certainly reasons that land clearing has happened, but I would say a lot of the land clearing we're doing now is being done in an irresponsible way, without significant proper forethought for the environmental benefits that are there by keeping it. Right, I'm going to call that the end now. So thank you all for those that did hang on for that last question. Please do send feedback through, either to me or to in response to the invite that you received to the webinar. We get to do these because they're popular and people like them. So please do let us know if it's good, or if there's something else that you want to hear about that you haven't heard about, that you think we should be doing webinars on, then please let us know. But other than that, have a fantastic evening and have a great festive season. This will be the last webinar of the year, I think, across the department. So hopefully we'll see many of you in the new year when we do something new.